construction makers.
This episode is going to be a bit more of a discussion. I think we've done a couple episodes like this before, but basically this is an idea that we're still thinking about and working through, and we figured we'd get on here and have a conversation about it. So the idea is this thing called negentropy, which is the opposite of entropy. In the real world, we have the concept of entropy, which means that generally things in the real world have a slow decline to disorder or to chaos, right? So if we build something, a building, a house, a car, whatever it is, over time it will slowly degrade to the point where it is not functional as the thing that we built it to do, to be.
Everything turns to dust.
Everything eventually turns to dust. So the opposite of that, which is negentropy, is the slow ascension, I guess, to order. I don't know how exactly to describe that movement towards the thing. Humans are particularly good at creating order out of chaos. We like to organize things into a form that is more useful to us. When this comes to game design, we can use this as a lens to view the way the force that a player puts upon your game system, which is a slow movement towards order. They're organizing your game to the point where it might be solved. And each time that a player goes through the cycle of playing your game and either winning or losing, basically finding a final state of your game in which they would restart it and play again, they are learning things and moving information in their minds towards order. This is a process called chunking, which is taking information that you learn, filing it away, and being able to reference it quicker later. If we're looking at a game as a collection of information that a player is seeking to understand, we as designers have to design systems of entropy into our games, because at a state of rest, a game does not move towards disorder. It doesn't move at all, a game's systems. So that's the idea. So with that framing the conversation, let's talk about this concept. And do we think this is a useful lens to see game design through?
I think when you brought it to me, I think the thing that stood out the most is being able to sort of look at concepts like variance and randomness, incentives for suboptimal play. So
Donkey Space.
We brought up in a previous video, role play technically is an opportunity for players to suboptimally play. All of these in a way are a form of entropy. So having an umbrella term to be able to associate those things, I think is good. I think it's good to be able to categorize those. When it comes to the force that players are having on the system being considered sort of a form of negentropy, I think is interesting, but I'm not sure if that's as useful as far as like a design tool. To me, it feels like it's leaning a little bit more interesting of like an idea as opposed to directly applicable, right? It's sort of saying like your players are going to play your game. And in a broader sense, or a more specific sense, your players are going to optimize the fun out of your game, which we talk about all the time.
I think this is a frame to look at that idea through.
Right. So having a term for that, for players optimizing the fun out of your game, I think is interesting. I do think that it is a little too broad to sort of associate that to all gameplay. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but I'm worried about designers hearing this concept and then sort of taking that to its most extreme and being like, well, all players are committing negentropy at all times.
I think they are. That's actually what I'm proposing. Yeah.
And I think that by earnestly playing the game, players are doing that. However, players do not have to do that. Players can engage in the game while technically not engaging in the game. Someone can sit down at a game and essentially participate, but not really actually be like reaching that solved state.
Whether or not a player is consciously participating in the optimization cycle of a game, I don't know if that matters. I think that a player learning the rules of a game even is a step towards order, right? You're like, I'm approaching this new world, this new system, and I don't understand how that world works at all. But I'm going to start taking steps to fully understand that world. And the first step I have to take is, how do I even play? How do I exist in this world? What are the things that are different in this world than are in other worlds? And so when we look at Dark Souls, of course, if we compare Dark Souls to, say, Assassin's Creed, right? The way that you control your character in that world is vastly different. And it takes a while for players to internalize the way that they interact in the world of Dark Souls. And in Assassin's Creed is leaning on a lot more internalized knowledge that players have from previous games to intuit how they're supposed to play in this game. And this is a design decision, right? This comes down to the designer's intent. How do the system's interactions shape the way that a player experiences the world? And if we're looking at that as a force that players put upon the game as they're learning it, we are sort of extending the life cycle of that game in that way because we're giving players more to learn. Now, that's not to say that that's necessarily good design, right? It depends on what you're attempting to achieve. But we can say that it does extend game time if a player must learn how to play the game before they can start optimizing the game.
There's already going to be viewers that see this and are like, I don't know what you're talking about when it comes to like me organizing the game.
Sure, right.
Or putting it into order.
Yeah.
Which is fine. It doesn't mean that that's not necessarily true.
You're saying like, well, when you play a game, you're actually organizing its information. I think you're right, kind of unintuitive because that's not the perceived experience that the player's having. If the force that the players are putting upon the game is organization or Negentropy, the quote of players optimize the fun out of your game is implying that the fun exists before they've achieved solved state, exhausted state, which means that the game has been organized in its totality. All of its information is now known. There's no unknowns anymore. When we describe games, we say they're meaningful decisions with uncertain outcomes and measurable results. And if any of one of those pieces is missing, then you don't really have a game. So if there's no unknowns anymore, right, the game is exhausted. It might be a game to somebody, but it's no longer a game to you.
Obviously, it's layered, right? If we're looking at an umbrella term of entropy to handle variance, randomness, suboptimal plays, etc., or incentives for suboptimal plays, then you have to ask the question, well, why? Right. So there's the terminology, and then there's, as a designer, deciding why is that something that you might want to include in your game.
Right. And that's where the quote comes in, right? Like without entropy or without disorder, players will optimize the fun or organize your game to the point where it's not fun anymore.
Elongating the life cycle of the game, right? So whether that's replayability or that's just an extension of the actual first playthrough of your game or something like that. I think another slight hang-up, you're sort of implying that players are committing negentropy to a system. The system prior is designed by a designer that has to incorporate forms of entropy for the players to have the expected outcome that players are going to commit negentropy. But on top of that, the designer is also having to create a system or opportunities for the player to be onboarded with negentropy. So that's where I'm like, I feel like there's maybe some mixing. Like, I feel like I almost want a different term for what the player's doing, but I get why the player's doing it. But then, like, what is that ambiguity of what is the designer doing when putting order in their game? Because a system is constructed.
Well, right. So yeah, when you're looking at like what is game design, right? Like if we stop and think about this for a minute, you could make a game, anything, right? Like any simulated, something on the spectrum between simulation and abstract, you're choosing a particular slice of reality to turn into a game. We are choosing what things to form order out of, right, to take and make orderly in a rule book, and we hand that to a player, and that player then reads it and interprets it. This is tabletop, but in a video game, you might have a tutorial, you might not. But you are choosing what's important and organized in that world to begin with, right? You're saying, here are the rules of the land. These are the laws of physics or, physics in this world. This is how this world works. You have to then understand and internalize them before you really can understand the game. I think we do have to start from some point of order, right? Because if we don't, nobody has, like, you could just say, okay, we're playing a game. There's games that experiment with that idea of like, you don't know all the rules of the game. You're playing the game, but you don't know the rules yet.
Sort of. Even then, you have to, usually,
there has to be something.
There has to be something. Yeah,
there has to be something to start from. And I think by creating those bounds, right, you're already starting players on the path to optimization, the path to solving the game and exhausting it, because you've created those bounds. So one system of entropy, I guess, could be that the bounds are expanding, something like Magic, where you're adding more cards to the system, which then expands what the game can do, right? You're changing the bounds of your established system.
So the system offers some sort of a base structure. Usually there's some sort of a rule set. If it's a video game, it's just the bounds of the world that you exist in and the controls that you are allowed as the player. Then you introduce opportunities for entropy. And I think that it's interesting because entropy is not just sort of like randomness or variance or whatever. It's also, I think, surprise can like also sort of be tied into that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you could theoretically present a situation or a rule or something that's like, oh, this is the context I thought it was, and now that I actually understand it in context, it was different than I thought it was.
It can just be discovering something, right? But I can see someone already thinking like, well, how soon do you introduce that entropy? Do you open the rule book and it's hieroglyphics? Like, do you? I
mean, Tunic kind of does that, right? So
not really, though. That's not actually the rule book, though. That's
like you learn how like different things about the game that you didn't know.
No, I know.
Like what buttons to push or whatever as you're unlocking pages to the rule book.
But you don't need that to know how to play the game.
To completely understand the game, you do. Right?
To completely understand it, sure. But
to
like you can still move, you can still...
Sure. Yeah, some of that's internalized, right? It's like, oh, this is how I move a character in a 3D world. I have a control stick, I'm walking around, right? Like, they didn't necessarily eliminate all that. So you're saying, what if you just rolled all that back to like nothing? Like a player exists in a space that's just fully just white, right? There's no walls, there's no floor, there's nothing.
And this is kind of where I think that design has to come into play. Yeah. Like that one, it's an interesting thought experiment, but it shows that there's probably some balance of design to be had, but like, what is that line then? There's never going to be a perfect ratio or anything.
No,
but
well, it's determined by you, the designer, right? You're the one deciding like, okay, well, how far away from the ultimate exhaustion of this game do I want to put the player? And like, you decide what those obstacles are. You decide whether or not you're going to operate on internalized knowledge that the players might already have and build something like Assassin's Creed, or are you going to go the Dark Souls route where they're players, when they first played Dark Souls, we're talking like originally, there's like almost no internalized knowledge for players.
I gotta say, what's Getting Over It?
Getting Over It experiments with this as well.
Yeah,
where
because at this point Dark Souls has borrowed from past Dark Souls, and
right?
So
Souls-like, it's a whole genre at this point, right? But we're saying like from the beginning, before anybody had played, almost anybody had played a Dark Souls game, it was a new experience. That's why it created its own subgenre. So like, you as the designer get to decide what's right for your game, and I think so much of that has to do with the intended experience that you're trying to give players and what's actually important to that experience. A good example here is something like, I'll come back to Assassin's Creed again, just because it's, I don't know, top of mind for some reason. The sort of climbing in Assassin's Creed, right? It's very easy. You just kind of walk up to a wall and you can scale it and wall run, or all these different things that you can do that makes climbing trivial, right? Where in a game like Jusant, you're literally simulating every time your character is grabbing the wall with the triggers of the controller. And there's like a stamina meter, and there's all these things that are like, okay, well, I'm trying to now simulate climbing because this game is about climbing. It's about that fantasy. Where on the opposite end of the spectrum, we're eliminating that stuff because it's not important to the experience we're trying to create. We're going to go ahead and exhaust that for the player and make the system as simple and seamless as possible to get them to the intended experience sooner.
So let's say like something like Assassin's Creed, right, where you're trying to onboard players faster, and give them less roadblocks possibly in their way. If that's the case, then that would be introducing like a large amount of negentropy, a lot of structure to the underlying system. See what I mean? It's like
no, right. Well, I think the way to think about negentropy is thinking about the force that players are putting upon your game. Right?
Yeah, that's what I mean though. Is that like it's the force that players are putting on the game, but if the game previously already has sort of like a lot of structure, is just saying it has a lack of entropy.
So I would think about it in terms of like your game is a certain amount of organized before a player has touched it. right? It's a certain amount. There's a certain amount of knowledge or information organization that a player arrives with, and you need to understand where your game fits on that spectrum, right? You need to understand that, oh, I assume my players are going to come with this foreknowledge because they've played other games like this. That's where genre comes from. Sure. But like the negentropy comes from players applying that knowledge, gaining new knowledge, organizing your game, solving the math behind all of the systems to get to the point where it's exhausted for them.
Let's say you have a game, and the entire game, all it is it's a video game, and you randomly will show up to people, and you hit A or B or whatever when you go up to a certain person, and that's it. Right. So it's not borrowing from any sort of an existing game. Players have preconceived ideas
other than
of buttons.
You can walk up and push a button. Yeah.
Right. Let's say you don't even control the walking. It just automatically does it for you, and you hit a button.
And you hit a button.
All right. So
sure.
What do you call that? Like if we're looking at this through the system of through these terms, right? The player, it's hardly a game because the player doesn't really have much opportunities, but let's ignore that. As far as entropy goes, you don't know maybe who you're going to run into, and maybe you don't know which button is going to pop up.
Sure.
You don't know what that person maybe is going to say if there's dialogue or something like that.
Right.
So there's surprise that you can learn. Maybe it's semi-random as well.
You're sort of describing a Skinner box in a way. Right?
Sure. But if that's the case, then what do you call that sort of it's like a lack of entropy.
The sort of scaffolding that exists before a player puts a force on it. I mean, that's like your system, right? That's the rules. I don't know if that necessarily needs a distinction within the idea of entropy or negentropy, right? We're talking about the forces specifically, not about the machine, right?
Right.
We're saying that the machine does not move, right? It does not inherently have entropy built into it, meaning that like a game other than like it's a physicality, right? Like, yeah, eventually a video game will break down and won't be able to be played anymore. We're talking about like literally about the systems of the game, right? There's no inherent entropy built into the system. At rest, it doesn't move. Where if it's something that exists in the physical world, right? A car, a house, whatever, those things break down over time. Like you have to actively repair them to maintain their structure. But a game's systems, there's no force put upon them. They're abstract. They're not in reality. They're not in the real world. So we have to design systems that apply entropy to them. Not necessarily that they're systems of like inherent, like the entropy is not like inherent to those systems. This is getting like really technical, but what I mean is it's a system that I guess you could more describe it as a barrier to negentropy rather than a system of entropy. I think it's easier to understand if you say it's a system of entropy, because you can, but it has to be in opposition to what the player's doing, right? Richard Garfield would refer to this as like his returns to skill with randomness, right? Like the return to skill in this instance. It could be you're negating the returns to control or the returns to something else, whatever it is, right? But you're creating a system that makes it so that a player has a harder time organizing the game's systems in their minds, the information in their minds to a solved state.
The closest thing is probably like frog fractions or something. That I don't know if you ever played frog fractions.
I haven't.
Yeah, it's basically a game that it's just relies solely off of surprise, but it's like the system changes every single time. And so you're playing like a different game. So the previous game you were playing is no longer relevant really to the new game that you're playing.
Sure, right. And that means you have like a reset of accumulated knowledge, right? So as a player is enacting negentropy on the system, it doesn't accumulate.
Sure. But at the same time, it's only a one and done sort of a game. And so it doesn't have the opportunity for you to go and replay it.
I think
it's a singular experience.
Right. And that's maybe the conflict here, right? Is that if you remove all of the players' negentropy, right, all of their force that they're putting upon it, so that as they're organizing information, they're not feeling that buildup of skill, then it's almost exhausted at that point, right? At that point, if a player recognizes that that's the case, they might go, well, this experience I'm not getting anything out of this. I can't get any better at this game. It's not to say that players only play games to get better, but like, I think once you would understand that like, oh, I'm just doing this loop over and over and over again. Well, Skitterbox style, obviously we know that is a hack that you can kind of use.
If the loop gets bigger, then absolutely,
right.
I'll still do it.
Right. What I'm hoping for, and the reason why I wanted to talk about this in this way at all, is that I'm hoping that this can unlock a different means to view this kind of thing through, right? Where normally if we're looking at, okay, I know that I need to put some amount of randomness in my game, or like whatever, not necessarily, but let's just say I know that I need to create some amount of replayability in my game.
Often it's that you'd have some sort of a system in place already, like a deck of cards where you know
sure, you're
this
borrowing
is
from
the
else.
amount of randomness that I'm going to have, and then you start to design around that.
Right, or dice or whatever it is. But again, some of those are internalized. So I do think I wonder about if we can look at it from the perspective of, oh, this is what I'm actually trying to do, which is stop or curb a player's move towards order when they're playing my game, curb their negentropy. I can then be free from the things that already exist that are doing that because I understand what their goal is now, and I can think up new ways to do that do something similar, right? Do achieve that goal, but in a totally new and profound way. And that, I think, is how we open the door towards new experiences, new games, new ideas that maybe people would have stopped at, I'm going to use a deck of cards, or I'm going to use dice, or I'm going to rely on just a player versus player environment to make it so that one player acting, like their acting force is imposed on the other player, right? And I think, and that's almost like one of the cheat codes here, I think, a little bit, is player versus player has this sort of like built in, theoretically. This is like where Donkey Space comes in, where if a game itself has effectively no systems of entropy on its own, something like chess, there's still another player there who might play suboptimally to try to fool their opponent. Like, let's say both players have perfect knowledge. You still might play suboptimally to try to fool your opponent to thinking that you don't know where the game is at, theoretically. That's Donkey Space. So, yeah, I think understanding, though, that that's what you're doing, and not just like, oh, I'm making a player versus player game, or I'm making a card game, or a dice game, or whatever. So now it's like, oh, I'm curbing a player's constant progress towards order.
Like a common pattern that I think I've seen is that, yeah, a lot of the times people will end up sort of designing a game, and what you described, it's like, well, I'm going to make a PvP game, or I'm going to make this, or I want to make a first-person shooter. And it's like, okay, cool. Like, that's great. That's something to start on, I suppose. But I think that what's been very difficult to design for has been designing around the concept of an experience. And I think it's particularly difficult to design for because there isn't this sort of general terminology or verbiage and education to the design aspect of game theory. There's a lot of game theory stuff and a lot of economic theory, but it's like completely separate. But the actual aspect of what makes for an interesting design is just not very prevalent in our industry. And I think that it has possibly contributed to a lot of this sort of general, yeah, I'm going to make a PvP game, I'm going to make a first-person shooter, I'm going to make a roguelike or whatever. But being able to sort of find these specific key points, right, and be able to better explain what our goals and intentions are when planning for an experience or an intent when we design, I think it's just going to make it a lot easier for us to explore in the future. If you enjoyed listening to us talk about negentropy and entropy and the other P's, please feel free to give us a little comment, maybe a like and a subscribe and all that stuff. Also, if you want to talk more about entropy and negentropy and that's it. Feel free to join our Discord. Generally. And games. You can talk about games. You can find a link to our Discord down in the description of the video below.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Well, I'll be sitting here and like slowly like sliding down the chair.